Welcome to GW Integrative Medicine, the podcast about disease prevention and health promotion from the Office of Integrative Medicine and Health at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences.
I'm Dr. Lee Frame, Director of the Integrative Medicine Programs here at GW.
And I'm Janet Rodriguez, the Office's Administrative Director. Today we're going to talk to Dr. Jed Fahey, a nutritional biochemist with an extensive background in plant and human nutrition and phytochemistry.
Dr. Fahey is a leader in chemoprotection. Most of his work has focused on sulforaphane, a compound found most abundantly in cruciferous vegetables and particularly in sprouted broccoli seeds. Dr. Fahey was an associate professor at Johns Hopkins Medical School, where he directed the Cullman Chemoprotection Center. He's now on the adjunct faculty there.
Dr. Fahey has faculty appointments in 3 departments at Hopkins in the schools of medicine and public health. He retired, that's in quotation marks, in mid-2020 to focus his attention entirely on outreach and educational efforts, which includes podcasts, writing, and lecturing widely.
So I'm so glad to have you here. Welcome very much to GW Integrative Medicine, Jed.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. I look forward to our chat.
I know it will be a good one. And for our listeners, this is someone who was a mentor of mine and I've been wanting to have on the podcast for a long time, was just waiting for the right moment. And here it is. This is the moment. So now that I've really talked you up, you better deliver.
You're too kind. But thank you.
Absolutely. So just as a primer, one of the things that we know that is involved in your work is advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. If you could just give us a primer on AGEs for a discussion.
Sure. And AGEs are not something that I spent most of my career studying, but had my eye on them for many years, 15 years probably. AGEs, which is, let's use the shorthand, advanced glycation end products, are harmful oxidation products that play a significant role in many chronic diseases. They're formed in our bodies when sugar combines with fat, protein, and even DNA, RNA in a process known as glycation. And so they're formed endogenously in the body, but they're also in the foods that we eat, so we consume them. And obviously, this is a place at which we can control our consumption of them. Methods of cooking and preparing foods alter their AGE content. And most critically, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, the highly processed foods, certainly ultra-processed foods by the NOVA scheme, as well as foods that are cooked at high temperatures by grilling them, broiling them, roasting, and frying, have dramatically increased levels of AGE formation. These are, if I can ramble on another second or so, these are all, by and large, they're the things that are formed in the Maillard reaction, which any chef or cook and most nutritionists know about. This is the browning, not caramelization, but the browning that occurs when you mix proteins and sugars together and heat them. And that's exactly what's going on when we increase AGE contents in foods. So our bodies can only eliminate part of the AGEs that we get, and they do accumulate in our tissues over time, and they cause oxidative stress and cause inflammation. And the research, which is ballooning, suggests that high AGE levels are linked to development of a huge variety of chronic illnesses, including heart disease, kidney failure, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and premature aging, which I think now has I don't know if it has a medical code, but many people regard aging as a disease which we can intervene in. Low AGE levels have been linked with accelerated wound healing, reduced inflammation and oxidative stress, improved insulin sensitivity, and even longer lifespan. So it's important to monitor them as part of the overall markers of health, and it's also this is. We can talk, and I'll take a breath and let you ask another question, but we can and should talk about how many are in certain specific foods and how this is really reflected in the sort of gross overabundance of ultra processed foods. So just tell me if you'd like me to launch into that.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that because that's something that I think of when I think of AGEs as ultra processed foods. But I don't know that the average person doesn't know what AGEs are. But even when we talk about this, a lot of times we're really talking about foods that are made at high temperatures, like grilling or the char. But in ultra processed foods, that may not be what's occurring there, but yet there are AGEs.
Yes, indeed. So one of the things that I didn't mention, because it's not an RDI, it's not a rule, it's not something that the dietetics and nutrition establishment has really come out with strong opinions on. Not that I care, of course, but what is a proper level? If we're going to talk about numbers, what is an appropriate level or a healthy level? And a lot of the initial studies say that something between 15,000 and 20,000 AGEs per day is probably a healthy limit. Because, as I say, we eliminate some, the body detoxifies some. So there's no dietary requirement, but we do know, one thing we know without question is that less is definitely better. So if you contrast, for example, this is an example that we've posted on a website I want to tell you about, but if you contrast fast food, American fast food, and this is a McDonald's Big Mac, a large fries, and a Diet Coke, that one parcel has 22,000 AGEs. If you look at a typical Mediterranean meal, broiled tuna, feta, salad, and red wine, it's about 11,000. If you look at a somewhat nasty, in my opinion, kids' meal of cheese doodles and a PB&J sandwich and apple juice, it's about 6,000. And if you look at a very vegetarian meal, plant-based meal with a Boca soy burger, grilled veggies, and black coffee, it's 600 AGEs.
Mm.
So there's a huge variation in meals, and it very much points to a plant-based diet, and to not, to raw or fresh foods, to boiling and steaming, and sort of points away from frying and roasting and broiling. I mentioned a website. I'm a part of a foundation that is aimed at whose aim is to educate people and develop apps and post data on AGEs. It's called the Anti-AGE Foundation. The website's anti-ages.org. I'd encourage your listeners to take a look at it. It's I think hopefully will be helpful over time.
Great, thank you. We will definitely make sure that that link is included in the notes for this podcast.
Good.
So, Dr. Fahey, what is chemoprotection and how does it relate to Healthspan?
So chemoprotection is a term we used a lot in a couple of decades ago, and we, in fact, named the center that I ran at the end of my career at Hopkins the Cullman Chemoprotection Center. My mentor, who is just deceased 3 years ago exactly, actually, Paul Talalay, I'm not sure that he coined the term chemoprotection, but our concept back then was that it is approaches, either dietary or chemical, i.e. drugs, that will protect a body, a person, against cancers. And we were focused, 25 years ago, we were focused almost exclusively on cancers. And this was when the sulforaphane phytochemical that I've spent a lot of time now working on was rediscovered in 1992, that was. And the thought then was that it was going to be a particularly effective phytochemical, a chemical from plants, against cancers. And it is, and it was, and it still is. But over time, we've come to see that sulforaphane, as an example, but many, many other phytochemicals, are also critically important in defending, in preventing, and perhaps defending against established variety of chronic conditions. So not just cancer, but cardiovascular disease, macular degeneration, a variety of nervous system conditions, including Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and autism. So, the list goes on, and I can go through that list with you. But lately, the past decade or so, I've taken to using the term health span, and in fact, there was some resistance to it from those sort of established people in chemoprotection for a while. But it's become a very widely accepted term now, and health span is essentially if you view a very simple graph of quality of life on the y-axis versus time in years on the x-axis, and think about it. You're born, if you make it through birth in the first 5 years, depending on, especially on where you live in the world, you are pretty good to go. Quality of life is probably as good as it gets. And then in this country, certainly, as people get into their middle age and certainly into their elder years, they're hit by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even concurrent chronic conditions. And so quality of life over time degrades in unfortunately, the vast majority of Americans, various countries, until one day you clock out. And I'm being deliberately a little bit crass, but I want to point out that health span, although it's pegged to lifespan, doesn't really have anything to do with lifespan. It's because we're not talking about extending lifespan. We're talking about extending that high quality of life curve, squaring off the quality of life curve, so to speak, so that one day your genetically predetermined endpoint, you just don't wake up. But boy, it's been a great ride until then. And that's, I can probably give you a more technical description of health span, but that's it. I mean, it's enhanced quality of life, functioning, near full functioning, until the end of life, as opposed to this gradual and highly predictable decline, which we see in so many people now.
I have to say, I literally got chills thinking about that. Like that is the ultimate for me, is to be completely healthy, be functional, be happy, and then one day just not wake up, as you said. And if we could have everyone get closer to that, I think that we would have a much healthier, happier society.
Lee, I couldn't agree more. And this is why I won't say I've become passionate about phytochemicals. I've always been passionate about them, but they play such a huge role in enhancing that health span. And back to the word lifespan, not necessarily lifespan. There are people who are working on senolytics and prolonging lifespan, and I applaud them. But that's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about making the time you have on this planet way better. And so the consumption of fat, carbohydrate, protein, and fiber, I know, we all know, we've heard so much about, but it's those added phytochemicals, which actually have a synonym that I'm starting to prefer to use nowadays also, and that's phytonutrients. I used to object to that because they're not nutrients in the classic sense of the word, but so many in the lay public sort of, they get creeped, or they bristle, or they don't like to hear the word chemicals when we're talking about their food. So whatever. I mean, I'm happy to call them phytonutrients, but if it makes people feel better. But essentially, these are low molecular weight compounds that are present in very small amounts in plants, and less than 1%, far less than 1%, by weight or by volume, and they're what give plants their color, their flavor, their smell, and they do all sorts of things to protect the plants, which are after all rooted in the ground and can't flee from pathogens. But they protect the plant, and our bodies are very capable of repurposing those compounds to protect ourselves. So, some compounds in plants, of course, are toxins. We shouldn't eat them. But um, yeah, let me stop there and take a breath again.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up as well, because there, as you've probably heard, there's a tribe of people who are quite appalled that experts would suggest that people should eat plants. Precisely for some of these phytochemicals, saying that they aren't designed to be helpful for us. They're designed to ward off pests. They're essentially like eating pesticides. What would you say to that group?
I'd rather not engage in that argument, but since you pushed me, I will. I mean, I think there's abundant evidence that human beings, at least over the past, maybe not from time zero, from the time we diverged as a species, but that human beings have evolved not as carnivores, certainly not as solely carnivores. We've evolved as omnivores, and I'm not averse to eating. Well, I should say, a lot of people ask me, well, Dr. Fahey, what's your routine? What do you do? Well, I'm not quite a vegetarian because I do eat bivalves. I love seafood, and I love oysters and mussels and scallops.
Well, living in Baltimore all those years will do that to you.
Yeah. And, you could argue that they're not sentient beings. And if you were really a vegan, if you're a vegan, maybe these should also be acceptable. But I don't want to get into the argument of veganism versus vegetarianism versus full on meat diets. But I think the way I personally have turned and twisted over the years is that in addition to plant-based diets or plant-forward diets or exclusively plant diets being far more healthy from the perspective of things like AGEs, things like phytochemicals, things like fat, things like satiety, there is this issue of the way that animals are cultivated, if you will, in the world, the amount of land that is taken up to pasture animals and to feed them, as opposed to directly feeding us. There's a map. I'll have to find a link and send it to you. It would be really interesting to link this to your show notes. So there's a map showing land use, different ways in which land is used in the United States, and it's like a jigsaw puzzle superimposed on a map of the USA. And grazing animals and feed for animals is by far the biggest chunk of our land use in the U.S. So that's not sustainable worldwide forever. You could certainly argue that the harvest of wild fish from the ocean isn't sustainable forever, and we've seen many species decline and tank. Most important to me is, and again, I'm not a member of PETA, but I do regard the way that animals are treated in caged, crowded conditions, CAFOs they're called, as inhumane. And even if I didn't regard them as inhumane and didn't give a damn about them, they're breeding grounds for foodborne illnesses, they're breeding grounds for antibiotic resistance, and they're unsafe and unhealthy for the workers by and large that are working in there at very low wages. So, I choose to vote with my wallet, I suppose, my pocketbook, and that is to stay away from beef, chicken, pork, certainly something like veal, bacon, and on and on. And but yes, I do eat some seafood, and now I live on the coast of Maine, so I can't avoid it. So.
Yes,
I wouldn't avoid it.
It's a rule.
Yeah.
In New England, it's a rule.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you talk about chemoprotection, a lot of times what you're talking about is cruciferous vegetables. Can you let us know what are cruciferous vegetables and what role do they play in chemoprotection?
Sure. What they are is many of the vegetables that you see on the shelf in the grocery store. They are broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, bok choy, Chinese cabbage, radish, arugula, kohlrabi, rutabaga,
Now, when you
and
say Chinese cabbage, is that what we sometimes call Napa cabbage
yes, it
here in the
is.
U.S.? Okay.
Well, it turns out that there are actually a whole host of closely related, I guess they're cultivars or subspecies. Um, yeah, but Chinese cabbage, Napa, it's called bok choy. It's called, yeah. There are a lot of variations found, very popular in Asian cuisine, and they're all in the cruciferous vegetable family.
How
And
about
then, of course,
Chinese, what they call Chinese broccoli?
Chinese broccoli is a little bit different, actually, but it's also in that family. Yeah. What's not in that family is lettuce, potatoes, beets, and a lot of vegetables, obviously. I didn't mention turnips; they're also in the family, the cruciferous family. Anyway, why did Lee ask me that question? I guess it's a good way to. Uh, so I know that she asked me that question because we've studied those vegetables, cruciferous vegetables, also called the brassica vegetables, for a quarter of a century now, or more, and the reason we have is because, first of all, they in their entirety were found by some early epidemiologic studies. Nutritional epidemiologists, look at dietary records and food frequency questionnaires and food recalls. They find out what people have been eating, and then they correlate that with their disease status or health status in various ways. And some of those early studies in the late 70s, 1970s, that is, identified diets rich in cruciferous vegetables, or people that, I guess the way to put it is people that ate 2 or more servings of cruciferous vegetables a day, as having a halved risk of colorectal cancer. And so that was this was important at the time. It was viewed as perhaps not right, and then people started to do more such studies and found out that, wow, yeah, it probably is. And then there was a meta-analysis done of, I think, 11 similar studies a number of years later that confirmed that. So having your risk of colorectal cancer by eating more cruciferous vegetables obviously isn't that difficult, if you are so motivated. So in 1990, in the very early 90s, Paul Talalay, who I mentioned, my now deceased mentor and sort of a grandfather of chemoprotection, started looking with his group at a number of cruciferous vegetables. They had an assay for cytoprotection. They had an assay that enabled them to look at how these compounds acted in a test tube or a Petri plate. And in fact, they found that many cruciferous vegetable extracts were highly protective against oxidative stress, and so they were cytoprotective. They then rediscovered, because it had been identified, but a molecule called sulforaphane, which is present in broccoli, almost exclusively in broccoli, I should say. And it has become widely accepted in the lay press that all cruciferous vegetables have sulforaphane in them. They do not. And I want to make that point very clearly. If I could underline what I say, I'm underlining it now. So they brought me on. Paul hired me in 1993 to try to find broccoli with more sulforaphane in it, essentially, because my previous part of 15 years of my career were as a botanist. So what I found then was that, in fact, broccoli sprouts had much higher levels of, it's actually the precursor of sulforaphane called glucoraphanin. Sorry for all the long chemical terms, but the sprouts had far more of it. In fact, the seeds and then the sprouts have far more of it than the mature broccoli plant. And so we, the Cullman Chemoprotection Center and my group, spent most of the next couple of decades really focused on broccoli sprouts and sulforaphane and the reaction that produces it once you chew broccoli, raw broccoli, or once it gets in your gut and your microbiome goes to work. Yeah, I mean, there is a rangeland weed out in California, out in the desert in the West, that has a fair amount of glucoraphanin in it. It is not edible, and there's a tiny bit in some arugulas and some kales, but again, by and large, it's only in broccoli. And so sulforaphane was, and still is the most potent naturally occurring phytonutrient / phytochemical, from the perspective of protection of cells, cytoprotection, inducing the human body's own metabolism to up its antioxidant game and to increase its anti-inflammatory game. Sulforaphane is also selectively antibacterial. I've done a fair amount of work on that with Helicobacter pylori. It is antiviral, and there's exciting work on that and SARS-CoV-2, and other coronaviruses, and actually a number of viruses. This work goes back a few years, and of course, there are people looking at it now with SARS-CoV-2. So it's got a really plethora of very interesting and disease preventive, protective properties, and that's why I spent almost a quarter of a century focused on it primarily.
That's fascinating. Lee, remember when we did that conference, and I think my exhibit table was set up next to the table for the folks from Hopkins who were talking about this, and also had sample bottles of supplements.
Oh, yes, yes.
So we've kind of come full circle with this. And folks, that was just when the Office of Integrative Medicine and Health had just started. So this was probably 2018, I think. But anyway.
Well, Jed could tell us some stories about how difficult it is to get that into a supplement.
Well, yeah, I mean, full disclosure, actually, Paul Talalay and his son and I started a company to commercialize broccoli sprouts, to promote broccoli sprouts back in 1997. And that company's in Baltimore and still exists and is doing well. And we did start selling broccoli sprouts, and we had co-packers around the country producing them. And I don't know, you're both too young to remember this, but there became a furor when there were some incidences of foodborne illness associated with, I believe it was alfalfa sprouts. And the FDA came out with a guidance suggesting that the very old, the very young, and the immune compromised not eat sprouts because there could be E. coli, there could be foodborne pathogens in them. The track record of commercially produced sprouts of all sorts has honestly remained very good. And if you compare number of foodborne illnesses cases with those from eggs and beef and other things, it's minuscule. Of course, a lot less people eat sprouts, but So a lot of people shied away from sprouts, and in fact, the business seemed to be not a great business to us. And the CEO at the time, who's still the CEO, Tony Talley, pivoted the business away from selling sprouts to selling an ingredient, which is rich in glucoraphanin, um, to supplement companies. And so it's a business to business now. And, that's, as I say, they've been going at that for a long time now. And yeah, it's very difficult to make these extracts, to certify them, to make sure they're have the titer of the compound you say you're delivering. And of course, then you sell them to a supplement company to incorporate into a tablet or a sachet or a pill. And as we all know, there are a lot of supplement companies that produce garbage. Some of them are fly by night, but there also are a lot of good supplement companies that are reliable and that test the heck out of their products before they release them, that monitor any possible safety events. So, yeah. So a long way of confirming what you said, Lee. I do know a bit about how difficult it is to get them into supplements. And, if I can blather on for a minute, the sort of obvious question there is, well, should you be eating your cruciferous vegetables, or
You
should
read my mind.
well, I've known you for a few years. Or should I be taking supplements? And it's like the question of, at a certain age, should I be having a life insurance policy? Does it matter anymore? I certainly strongly advocate eating a healthy diet, plant forward, rich in plants, rich in broccoli and cruciferous vegetables, and doing that for life, starting in early childhood. And of course, it's important to develop those tastes in infancy, or maybe even in utero, because you start eating those tasteless Cheerio type puffs as your first solid food, and what the heck do you get as a taste sensation to train your palate later in life? But anyway, so the reason for eating the whole plants is, I think, clear to most nutritionists, and that's, first of all, you're getting a lot of fiber with whatever phytonutrients you're getting. You reach satiety, you are satisfied and stop eating after a bit. When you eat empty calories or suck down as much sugar as you can, that's not what happens. So it's filling, it's sort of self-regulating. You get grossed out if you eat too much of any vegetable, and you stop. However, and Lee, I think I've talked about this with you years ago, as someone who got my doctorate in the Bloomberg School of Public Health and was exposed to some of the real problems that the world and this country have in terms of food and feeding and nutrition. I do realize that there are plenty of people that just won't eat, either don't like or just won't eat many vegetables, or they'll only eat iceberg lettuce and potatoes. And, is it, as responsible public health people and as nutritionists, is it our job? Is it right, I guess I should say, to tell them, forget about you, you're not going to do it my way, take the highway. Hope you get all sorts of chronic diseases. Well, that's not cool, and it's not right, and it's not ethical or moral. But we do have some choices, and one choice is that, people like that probably can and should take a number of supplements that help to bolster their immune system, enhance their oxidative capacity, especially if they're eating a lot of bacon and eggs and Big Macs. The other thing I'd just like to mention, and I will come back to it as often as you would like, but I think big food has a huge role that they could play if they wanted. They don't want to, by and large. And so I think they are hugely to blame, because the ultra-processed food that has flooded our markets for the last 40, 50 years, more and more lately, and is now flooding developing country markets all over the world, is poison. It's analogous to cigarettes. And it's killing people because it's so high in sugar, so ultra processed. There are a ton of harmful, documentably harmful compounds in those foods. Their phytochemical content is either nil, it's non-existent, or it's far lower than whatever plants they say are in those foods. They're very high in AGEs because most of them have been pressure treated, high pressure and temperature, to extrude them into wonderful doodles and shapes and Cheerio type designs. And so they bear a lot of responsibility for the epidemic of chronic disease and obesity that we're seeing in this country and around the world today. Yet they could, by changing their game, they could be part of the solution, because you're not going to stop people from eating convenient food. And I know Coke, Pepsi Cola, and McDonald's, they've all paid lip service to, improving their game. But I better stop there. You're getting me worked up, and I'm supposed to be retired.
Well, so we definitely need to do some stress management. That's important too. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you have your eyes on anything in particular in terms of research. Like, what's exciting? What should we be looking out for right now?
I think an ability that I don't feel we had 15, 20, 25 years ago when I was first starting in this phytonutrient pursuit, and that's our capacity to look at many things at once. So, back in the 90s, if we wanted to look at the effects of sulforaphane and something that we thought might be additive or synergistic, combinatorial bioassays were extraordinarily burdensome, difficult to do, difficult to have good controls for. Nowadays, people can do that kind of thing in their sleep, and not two compounds, but multiple compounds together. And that ability is growing, and it's very important for phytochemical research, phytonutrient research. I guess the other part of that equation is the outcomes, and that's metabolomics. And so also 25 years ago, there was no metabolomics. Now it's all over. It's getting cheaper and cheaper by the day. And what that allows you to do is when you deliver in an experimental or a test system, or in humans that are eating whatever they're eating, it allows you to measure changes or differences in the profiles of compounds that result from that phytochemical intervention or ingestion. And this is important. Again, these things are linked intimately with our metabolism. So people are able to shed light on those linkages and how they lead to various chronic diseases. This is being done now. Very imaginative people are doing this all over the world. And I think that's going to be a good thing for chemoprotection or health span research, and for phytochemical research. I think one of the other points that's worth making is that there are combinations of phytochemicals and drugs which are either positive or negative. Sulforaphane, for example, has some very well documented now synergies done by Hua Liu and Paul Talley, with whom I work. So that exemestane, an aromatase inhibitor that's widely used in breast cancer treatment, not prevention, but treatment, and sulforaphane are synergistically active. Or I put another way, sulforaphane synergizes exemestane. Cisplatine another drug in which interactions with sulforaphane have been examined. But then, then there's the well-known grapefruit juice versus cytochrome P450 interaction. So these interactions are important, and we're becoming far better able to study them now with modern AI and metabolomics, as I mentioned, and other technologies that just didn't exist 15 or 20 years ago. The other, and Lee, I'm surprised you haven't asked about this thus far, but as you know, I'm not the expert on it. The other area of very exciting is the gut microbiome, and specifically how the gut microbiome is influenced by phytochemicals, and how it influences metabolism and absorption and disposition of phytochemicals. And again, sort of carbon copy what I just said about 25 years ago versus now. There are a ton of people that are doing extraordinary things in the gut microbiome, and I believe you've had some on your show.
I agree. I like to think with the microbiome and with a lot of these is we're starting to really understand the mechanism that we saw in earlier studies where we could do mostly just observational, look at long-term outcomes. Now we can figure out exactly why. And like you're pointing out with the drug phytonutrient interaction, perhaps we can optimize that to be either more preventative or to actually be a treatment.
Yes, exactly.
Well, wonderful. Definitely something to look forward to. I'm also going to look forward to having you back on because I think we could talk way more about this, but also lots of other things. But that is all the time we have for today. So thank you so much for joining us, Jed.
Thank you so much to both of you for having me. It was my pleasure, and I'm always happy to get up on my soapbox and talk about things like this that I'm passionate about.
Well, we learned a lot.
Yes, we did.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the GW Integrative Medicine podcast from the GW Office of Integrative Medicine and Health.
I'm Dr. Lee Frame.
And I'm Janet Rodriguez. Thanks for listening.